I haven't been able to sleep for some time now. It comes and goes in chunks of time like stagnant river of still water, weighing me down with an endlessly relentless restlessness that keeps me mired in a mud pit of worries and impossible intrusive anxieties that, like the coming of day, will never come to pass. I think I'm on day 3, and I feel like I'm starting to lose my mind. Every time I think I've gotten at least a fleeting chance of catching some rest, something will inevitably come to mind that plucks me out of that liminal state between wakefulness and my dreams, and back into the boggy dread of the dead of night that by now I know better than my own mother. I know better than to utter a single word of this to anybody, but perhaps in my writing I can get this off my chest, and maybe, if I'm not getting my hopes up, I can put my mind at rest and finally lay down to at least one night of decent sleep. I can only wish for such a mercy at this point. I have always had difficulties when it comes to getting to sleep. Like I said, this tends to come and go. But as of late, I haven't been able for what has to have been about a year of hellish hay fever of night sweats and a near nightly sense of dread and doom coming, followed by hours upon hours of harrowing what-ifs, whose faults, and why isn't, until like a switch, the dark of the early morning is broken by the first chimes of the dawn choir of finches living in the maple trees that line the avenue my house lies on, and where I live, if you want to call it living. By the time the day begins to break, when the sky lightens and the soft sound of early morning commuters sleepily driving by begins to hasten, I can set my mind at ease to a certain degree, and the ceaseless worries of the night before go silent as I drift into a light stillness that substitutes a proper night's sleep. But it doesn't come. No drugs, no drink, no medication or meditative effort seems to be helping lately. And I feel like I'm going mad, and there's nothing for it, because eventually the light come low and scatter the shadows of the houses and trees of my subdivision into the low-lying rivers of darkness, and she, or it, will be back. Yes, she. Whenever I give into exhaustion and try to tuck into my bed, I close my eyes and I try to get comfortable, until some time goes by and it becomes apparent that I'm not alone. It starts as a flow of ink in my mind's eye as I lay with my eyes closed, and swirls into a multitude of muddy colors in formations I have never seen elsewhere or been able to describe. As I struggle in vain to open my eyes, I increasingly feel an outside presence, somewhere in the room with me, lurking as the atmosphere begins to gain weight around me, and I can't open my eyes to see physically. As the unyielding heaviness of the air begins to increase, my ears pop, and a low and building hum comes into my mind that gets louder and louder, and the underlying sense of doom in my surroundings becomes so unbearable that I forget myself, where I am, what I'm doing, and who I am, leave my mind as the sense of approaching death comes to me. A bizarre sense of burning pain starts to overtake my entire body, from my feet slowly up to my head, and the swirling mass of indescribable forms and hellish void start to materialize into a face. The face of a grotesque, soulless husk of a girl or woman, or something that takes up every bit of my vision. I'm having a nightmare, I used to say in my mind, and the girl, sallow and revolting, would start to grin an unnaturally wide and jagged smile, as her hollow and empty eye sockets still seemed to suggest a cruel and evil gaze, and an echoing whisper in a warm, putrid breath slithered into my ears. You do not rest. You do not sleep. You do not dream. Paralyzed and hopeless, I lay in my bed, unable to escape her gaze, desperately trying to pry my eyes open only to come to the horrifying revelation that they are already open. My eyes only widening to an unnatural extent as the figure above me stands outstretched and hungry, with its slender skeletal body hunched hungrily over me, her gaunt face twisted and rigid less than an inch away from mine. The smell in my nostrils was rank, like an overwhelming sweetness mixed with the smell of warm decay and hot, moist breath. She continues to stare at me with her face contorted, just as still as I was as I lay unable to move or break out of paralysis. My heart is pounding so hard, it feels as though it will explode at any moment, all as the shrill and yet somehow sing-song sound of her whisper echoes over and over in my mind. You will not wake. You will come with me. Like a skipping needle on an ungodly record player, she torments me. All I can do is resist and fight to keep my sense of self, which seems to be slipping away into her decaying and spindly fingers as she continues to smile in a twisted and gleeful sense of malice as I try desperately to regain control of my body. In a last-ditch effort to make the sign of the cross with my tongue, hoping that will save me, and she howls a screeching cackle that sinks into a deep and guttural laughter. I suddenly gain control of my eyes and shut them tightly as quickly as they came to mind. All I could hear was the sound of my heart pounding and the blood coursing through my veins. And after what feels like a lifetime, I am able to regain control of my breath and slowly start to calm myself down. As the sound of my heartbeat starts to dissipate, I realize I am alone. As the soft and familiar chirping of the neighborhood birds come to my mind, I breathe a sigh of relief, and the soft glow of daybreak tells me the long night has finally come to an end. I wish I could say this is a one-time experience for me, just an awful case of sleep deprivation, or a terrifying recurring nightmare. But my reality is far worse. As peaceful as my house is in the daytime, and as silent as my mind at daybreak can be, I know that as soon as the night comes, as soon as I lay down again, she will be there waiting. Even during the day, if I try to get some rest, I can still feel her in my periphery, peeking at me from the other room, or lurking around the corners smiling and whispering, all the time whispering and laughing and gazing at me with hollow and hungry eyes. Help me. I'm lying here in my bed, an uneasy feeling churning in my gut. For weeks now, she won't stop smiling at me. It's not a friendly smile, it's unsettling. I see her everywhere. On the bus, to and from work, at the grocery store, the library, even at the deserted gas station that only has 3 regular customers. I don't have anyone to reach out to because I live in a small town where the police take nothing seriously. I dread having to take the bus tomorrow. I know she'll be there, waiting and smiling. Morning, 5:42 a.m. I have just woken up from a dream about her. In it, she wore a long orange raincoat. I looked out my window and saw her standing at the bus stop, her orange raincoat and the dingy brown leather backpack she always carries. I don't understand why she carries it. It always seems empty. In the dream, she wasn't smiling. I woke up immediately after spotting her. I jumped in the shower, hoping the feeling would wash away. After dressing in my suit and slipping on my shoes, I headed out the door. To my relief, she wasn't at the bus stop this morning. I got on the bus and stood as we drove through the neighborhood. About 4 minutes later, we arrived at my workplace. I took the elevator to my office. I used to get coffee in the lobby, but now I avoid social interaction. My coworkers might notice. The other day, a work buddy asked how I was doing. I told him I was fine, but I don't think anyone would believe me if I told them what was going on. Besides, I'm a man. I shouldn't be intimidated by a woman who smiles at me. So why am I? That evening, 6:12 p.m. I just got home. Still no sign of her. But why does that worry me even more? I don't have time to dwell on this. My boss gave me papers to fill out, claiming they needed to be done by Monday. It's Friday, and there's a stack of papers in my bag. Later, 8:31 p.m. I've completed about a third of the papers. I want nothing more than to lie down and go to sleep. I undress and take a hot shower, the most relaxed that I can get. Afterward, I put on my sleep clothes and microwave a cup of noodles. I kick back in my recliner and watch a random TV show while I eat. 9:47 p.m. I turn out the lights and double check that my doors are locked. I hop into bed and pull the covers over me. 2:56 a.m. I wake up for no apparent reason. My throat is dry and I need to use the bathroom. My small apartment has only one bathroom, all the way on the other side of the apartment. I go anyway, not turning on any lights to stay sleepy. After finishing up, I grab a glass of water and head back to my bedroom. On the way, I notice my window is wide open. I can't believe I forgot to shut it. I guess my memory isn't the best, even though I'm only 32. I shut the window and go back to bed. 3:09 a.m. There's someone in here. I can feel it. I am being stared at. 3:11 a.m. I see her. She's sitting in the corner of my room, her back turned to me. Her wet brown hair hangs over the back of the chair. She's rocking slightly, singing a lullaby in a language I have never heard. I'm staring at her wide-eyed. I strain to move, to scream, to do anything to get away. But I can't. It's like I'm not in control of my own body. She stills and stops humming. I feel a tear roll down my cheek. Am I crying? Her head slowly turns all the way around to look at me. She's not smiling. Her face is unreal. Pale blue eyes, hollowed. A skeletal nose. Thin, flaky lips. Her body is disturbingly skinny. Every bone visible. Beneath her raincoat is a floral lace nightgown, also drenched. Her breathing is a sickly rattle. She lowers herself from the chair to the floor, her bones cracking with each movement. She crawls toward the foot of my bed, her limbs moving unnaturally. She climbs into my bed. I can't move. I can't scream. Tears are falling. She looks into my eyes blankly. No smile, no blinking. She lies beside me, wraps her arms around me, and rocks me back and forth, singing that same disturbing song. I still cannot move, but something inside me doesn't want to. It's as if I can feel her heartache and pity her. Hours go by as she rocks me, singing the song. I start to feel sick. She quiets and crawls out of my bed, her bones cracking as she leaves. She crawls out my window. 9:21 a.m. It's as if nothing happened last night. My window is completely locked, and everything is just as I left it. So what do you think this was? Sleep paralysis? It's been months. and I haven't seen her again. It all felt so real. I don't know what to do. Lately, there has been strange occurrences that have been brushed aside by my family and I, but when thought about, are very disturbing. Before I describe what happened to me a couple nights ago, I'll tell about what I have seen before this incident, and things that my mom has experienced as well. I think between the fight or flight senses, I am a weird mixture of freeze and a very slow flight. One night, I was walking to the living room to get my phone charger, which I had left in there. It was dark, and the only light that was on was the stove light. When I entered into the living room, for some reason, I stared behind the couch at the coat rack. That thing has always creeped me out. It looks like someone standing there in the dark, motionless, and waiting to jump out at me. But I chose to ignore it most of the time. Before I could walk any further, I saw a head duck behind the couch. Now, this figure had probably been there the entire time, but I just didn't notice it until it moved. In that moment, I just stood there in absolute terror, and then slowly backed away and returned to my room. I ended up cautiously returning later on to get my charger though, if anyone was wondering. To switch stories, there have already been 2 different times where my mom has come to me and said that she heard me calling her name when I hadn't. The first time she was in the bathroom during the day and heard me say, "Mom." When she got out of the bathroom, I wasn't there, and I told her that it wasn't me who called her name. The other time, I was in my brother's room watching a TV show pretty late at night with him when my mom walked into the room and said, "I just heard you calling me and I woke up. You sounded distressed or something." We brushed it off as weird, like we usually do, and went on doing what we were doing. However, this latest experience of mine had us all thinking that something is going on in this house. The night this happened, it was around 2 a.m., unable to go to sleep due to my mind racing at 1,000,000 miles per hour. I felt more uncomfortable than usual, both mentally and physically. But finally, at around 3 a.m., I fell asleep. I would wake up at random points in the night, half asleep and exhausted, and began to have strange sleep paralysis episodes. They were bothersome, irritating, and anxiety-inducing. One involved a buzzing sound that a large wasp would produce echoing around my room. Now, buzzing sounds have always bothered me, especially since I have a slight phobia of any buzzing insect. After that, my room started warping, like I had just finished staring at an optical illusion. My fake plants began looking scarier, as the leaves seemed to resemble sharp, stretched-out arms. I felt a strong apprehension that this would all get worse. And I was right. After these short but distressing episodes, I fell back asleep. Only minutes later, surprise, surprise, I woke up again. This time, nothing was in my room, or so I thought. I felt a presence on my right, the side of my bed that wasn't pressed against the wall. At that moment, the paralysis I was experiencing was strange. I could move my head, but it was a major burden to do so. It seemed terribly heavy, and all my eyes wanted to do was close again. With a strong effort, I turned slowly to my right. Kneeling beside the head of my mattress was a black figure. Its shoulders were hunched over disturbingly, and all I could make out was its wiry, short hair. For some reason I am not aware of, I thought this thing was my mom. I gasped. "Mom," I said. Don't do that." It was harder to speak than I expected. The thing giggled. If that wasn't enough to make matters worse, it sounded exactly like my mom. After that, it disappeared. I don't know what exactly is happening or why we have been experiencing something in this house that likes to mimic the people who live here. All I could do is hope that I never see that thing again. I'm 31, a male, and just went through the most insane thing that has ever happened to me. And I just had to put it out here for the world to read. Not as entertainment, but as a precaution. A warning. I haven't done much with my life, and my career is non-existent as a cashier at a local, very well-known auto parts store in Nowhere, North Carolina. I used to sit at night after work and wish to myself over my microwaved TV dinner that something exciting would happen, and my life would spiral instead of out of control in an upward and firework way. And then she walked into the store one day. A vision of beauty for my sore eyes. It was like the wind followed her in, and everyone had to look. There were two other options for her, two other cashiers standing there. But her crystalline blue eyes locked with mine, and she approached me. Just like second nature, I smiled. She returned a smile that could rise the sun. For a second, we stood there just smiling at one another, until finally the words found my lips, and I asked her how I could help her today. From there, things spiraled all right. They spiraled me straight into my own personal hell. You see, I wanted to love her, but she made it impossible. The first 2 dates were exhilarating. We had everything in common. Books, colors, movies, you name it. And it was both our favorite. Oh, how I wish I had known that game I was playing. The third date came, and things became even more tantalizing as we discovered each other in an intimate way. Work for me has never been something that I considered in the way of my social life. But while at work, I began receiving messages from her telling me that work consumed too much of my time, and that the time I spent at work should be dedicated to her. And if I really loved her, that I would leave work early, just call out. Those kinds of things. At first, it was kinda cute, playful type of banter. Until one day I was working when my manager called me to the office to speak with me. He informed me that my sister, quote-unquote, just called, and said that I needed to leave work because my mom was injured. Of course, panicking, I clocked out. As soon as I stepped out into the parking lot and looked at my car on the side of the building, there she stood, smiling. I walked over and began telling her what had happened, and she informed me that she was the one that made the call because she wanted me to get off and spend some time with her. I was irritated, upset. I told her you don't do things like that, ever, and told her that I now must continue to cover her lie. Getting in my car, I tell her that at this time I am not in the mood to spend time with her. I would contact her once I calmed down and sorted out this ridiculous situation. I left her standing in the parking lot and watched in the rearview mirror as she stomped her feet while standing in place. It looked as if she looked up to the sky and screamed. I just kept driving. By the time I arrived home, mind you, I only lived 10 minutes from my job, she had sent 13 text messages apologizing and begging that I let her come over and show me how sincerely sorry she was. Along with those texts, she called 9 times. It was in that moment that I made the decision that her and I were not going to work out. Contemplating how to deliver this news to her, I decided since we really weren't an item, a text message would do. Here's the words I sent to her. Copy and paste. Hey, I don't think this is going to work out. I'm sorry. I do appreciate the time you spent with me. Those moments and memories will remain, but I don't think I'm truly ready to commit, and I'm sorry that this revelation has occurred with you. I got no response. And for a while, I really thought that everything was good, and she understood, and like any normal person, was backing off and moving on. I have never been more wrong about something in my life. A week later, working my normal Tuesday shift, she prances into the store and says that she needs her battery checked and her windshield wipers changed. In this store, we change wipers and have a handheld device that will read the charge on your car battery. One of my coworkers, obviously captivated by her just as I was when we first met, offered to take care of the situation. She coldly rejected him and looked right at me and indicated that she preferred that I do it. Reluctantly, I picked up the handheld device and walked to the door. She stood in place, making it to where I had no choice but to open it, because I didn't want to give her any expectations of rekindling anything. Once outside at her car, I asked her to press the button that released her hood so that I could open it. She began doing this and then stopped and stepped out of her car, walking towards me with this look in her eyes, a tone that sprayed ice as she spoke. She leaned in and whispered in my ear, "Breaking up with someone over text is a cruel and unusual form of punishment." I know many cruel and unusual forms of punishment. You don't know whose heart you just broke. Shocked, but angered at her threat, I told her that we were not an item, and I didn't break up with her because there was nothing to break. We dated casually and it didn't work out. That's all. There was no label, no title to our relationship. I could see in her eyes this was a shock. Her eyes read as if we had been dating for years and I cheated, and then coldly left her. My blood chilled at the expression on her face. Angrily, she yanked open her car door, practically threw herself in the car, and sped away. Something told me that that was not the last time that I would see her, and I couldn't have been more right. To spare some time, now that I have given plenty of context to how this started, let's talk about how it officially ends. About 2 weeks after the car battery and windshield wiper event, she continued to text me threatening messages and leave obscene and threatening messages on my voicemail. Not all were threats. Some were pleading and begging me to talk to her, to go out one more time and let her show me how great our companionship could be. At the advice of a friend, I didn't block her because my friend warned that could potentially escalate things. He suggested that I simply just put her notifications on silent and continue to ignore them. And that's what I did. I closed the store down one night and left around 10:15 p.m., typical time for closing the store. On the way home, I considered ordering a pizza, taking a shower and relaxing, watching some movies. I did have the next day off, so I could stay up and enjoy the wind down after work. Walking into my apartment, I locked the door behind me and grabbed the pizza coupons I hung in the fridge and decided. After ordering the pizza, the guy told me it would be about 45 minutes. Considering it was a Friday night, and they were busy, and were short a delivery driver. I told him if the pizza was hot when I got it, that it was fine by me. This allowed me some time to shower. I began taking my clothes off as I made my way to the bathroom. Who doesn't do that when they're home alone, right? Starting the shower and setting up my speaker to play some music, knowing that if the pizza arrived while I showered, they would leave it at the door, so there's no rush. I stepped in the shower and let the water run from head to toe, just enjoying the feeling of my muscles relaxing in the warmth. I started my typical in-the-shower washing routine, leaving my face for last. It's a habit. Rubbing the face wash in, I closed my eyes and put my face under the streaming water, enjoying the cleanliness that I was feeling. I pulled my face out and ran my hand over it, and opening my eyes, I nearly slipped and broke my neck as a silhouette was framed, standing on the other side of the shower curtain. I called out in a panicked voice asking who was there and that they better leave now or I'm going to call the police. The silhouette then held up its hand to show me that it was holding my phone. I could see my chest pounding with every rapid heartbeat. When the silhouette finally spoke, it was her, telling me that I needed to go ahead and step out as she passed my towel to me without opening the curtain. I wrapped my waist, not even drying myself, and slowly began opening the curtain. She stood there, my phone in one hand, and the largest kitchen knife I had ever seen in the other. "Your pizza's on the counter. Let's eat," she said, directing me that way with the knife. I followed her instructions, thinking to myself she obviously is unhinged, but I must get myself out of this situation, and preferably alive. I walked into my living room that is one open space, with my kitchen only divided by the bar that is there, and on the counter sat the pizza. I grabbed the box and she directed me to the couch, where candles were lit, and a movie was pulled up to play. I asked her how long she had been here, and how she got in here. She told me she had been here since this morning, waiting for me to come home to her, and that she had copied my key the night we slept together for the first time. Beside myself at this point, I'm not sure how this was going to go, or more matter of fact, how this was going to end. I asked her if I could please put some clothes on before we eat. She dropped her eyes to the towel around my waist and smirked. I felt objectified and shuddered, passing it off as feeling a tad cold in only my towel. She agreed, but told me that she was coming with me so that I don't try anything. Still wielding the knife, she followed down the hall to my room and waited, sitting patiently on my bed and watching my every single move. I was horrified. I could not at this moment figure out how I was to get out of this situation safely. It wasn't only my safety I was concerned for. I also did not want her to get hurt, even though she was holding me at knife point in my apartment. Once I finished dressing, I walked back towards the living room. She followed. I waited for her to tell me where she would like us to go to sit and eat while watching the movie. She directed me to sit where the arm of my couch was, and she was going to adjust herself against me in a cuddling position. It occurred to me then, this was my way out. Smiling at her, I sat down and patted the cushion next to me. Her eyes shifted at the invitation, and I could read on her face that she was confused by my smile. So I let it fall slowly off my face to seem as innocent as I could. I told her that I'm just going to try to make her feel more comfortable with me. I didn't want her to think that she needed a knife to protect herself around me, pretending to play the fool to the real reason for the knife. At this, she smiled to herself and sat. At first, she was stiff, and then she began to cry. I watched her in utter disbelief that in this moment she felt she was the one that should be crying. A selfish thought, I know, but she was holding me hostage. As she was crying, she looked at me and began telling me that the reason she had the knife was not for her protection, but because she was going to kill me. Her entire plan was released between hysterical sobs and bouts of random laughter. She planned to break in, force me to spend some time with her, and then once it was over, we would go to bed, and she was going to stab me to death in my sleep. I was in shock. I couldn't even figure out a word, emotion, or anything to acknowledge what she was telling me. As she talked, she began to relax, and slowly and subconsciously, she laid the knife on her knee, still wrapped up in her spill about living her life knowing that I was loving and caring for another woman that wasn't her, and was not something that she could even fathom a thought of. It drove her wild, made her crazy, she was saying. She shut her eyes to sob loudly again, and I lunged, pushing her against the back of the couch with one arm, and grabbing the knife with the other hand. Her eyes flew open in a rage, and she was grappling with me to get the knife back. The entire time I'm reassuring her that she does not need to do this. We barely know each other. She will find someone better. All those things that I thought were the right things to say, none of them were any consolations to her. Finally, I threw the knife down the hall and rolled her onto her back as she took her fingers and began trying to pry my eyes out with her manicured claws. Pain surging through my face and eyes, I put all my strength into subduing her arms and pinning her to the floor. She kicked and squirmed, screaming and yelling at the top of her lungs. It was then that my front door burst open, and in ran my neighbor from across the hall. I had never been more excited to see him in my life. Not realizing how the situation looked and caught off guard at his emergence, I froze. She then kneed me in the forbidden area and then climbed on top of me, hitting and beating me in the head as hard as she could. Let me tell you something, crazy doesn't hit like a girl. The impact of each hit felt more and more like she was trying to bash my brains out of my skull. It was then that she pulled another small knife out of her waistband and lunged it into my side. The indescribable pain of that moment was followed by another directly in the center of my chest. I could feel the cold metal as it entered my body. She then lifted the knife above her head and was about to plunge it into my face when my neighbor lifted her off me and held her pinned in his arms as she fought and screamed, kicking and squirming. I grabbed my phone as quickly as I could and dialed the police, bleeding and terrified for my life. I helped my neighbor hold her in place for the police when they arrived. It felt as though it took them hours, but it wasn't more than 10 minutes when the first two officers ran, weapons drawn, into the door of my apartment. Immediately, she began sobbing and yelling that I tried to assault her, and she was just defending herself. The first officer grabbed me and took me down. I protested, trying to get my story out, but I was being detained, and they were having none of what I was saying. At the time, I was infuriated, but after some thorough investigating, the police uncovered that she had a violent past that included stalking, falsifying a police report, assault, and one dismissed charge of attempted murder. Rushed to the hospital for my injuries, I was treated, and thankfully she was a few centimeters shy of taking my life that day. The doctor said she missed a main artery by a little under 2 centimeters. There is no moral to this story, just the fact that it happened. I'm alive, and she is in prison. I am a physician out of Western Massachusetts. Unfortunately for me, I started as an officially licensed doctor fall of 2019, meaning that the pandemic is where I had to get my sea legs for being a hospitalist, so to speak. Being a new physician during the pandemic was harrowing for a lot of reasons, but this experience was by and away the most disturbing I have had since I started practicing. I have never completely understood why people have such an intense fear of oblivion. If you were kidnapped, tortured, and eventually killed by Albert Fish, would you truly be interested in an afterlife where you retain that memory? Death is often very merciful because of its true erasure. You no longer have to live with the terrible pain or haunting experiences. Trauma lives on for only those who can remember it. And as for hell, I think we are able to create something much worse than fire and brimstone, even with the best intentions. That is where this story comes in. During the height of the pandemic, a lot of non-ICU staff were being asked to help run the ICU because the volume of critically ill patients was so unbearable. Normally, I only work with hospitalized patients on the regular wards floor, but in December of 2021, I was drafted to be a pseudo-ICU doc, much to my own dismay. The vast majority of our ICU patients were intubated. For those of you who are unfamiliar, this means that they had a breathing tube in because their lung tissue was completely non-functional. Despite what you might see on TV, most patients who are intubated are given sedating medications. They essentially sleep through their experience. This is both humane and therapeutic. We generally don't want people who are intubated to be trying to breathe on their own. It can essentially overinflate their lungs. The day this happened, it was like any other normal shift. The patient in question was a 60-year-old woman with no past medical history. She had been intubated for 2 weeks because her immune system had essentially shredded her lungs, trying to eliminate her COVID infection. Pretty much the same story as everyone else. And like many others, she was slowly recovering. Her blood pressure, however, had really been a difficult thing to control. It had been dangerously low intermittently throughout her entire admission. Because of this, the sedating medication that we used primarily was ketamine, which generally does not have an effect on your blood pressure. If anything, it actually makes it a little bit higher. But it can be associated with dissociative reactions, which is a type of psychosis. When you've been on the ventilator for that long, your trachea actually starts to become rigid and inflexible. If that change happens, you can't really breathe without a ventilatory tube. Your body has essentially molded around this foreign instrument. Because of this, 2 weeks or so is when we decide whether or not you need to have a tracheostomy performed. Think the smokers with a hole in their neck. This often has a very negative impact on a patient's life. So in an effort to see if she could breathe on her own, we began lowering her sedation. 30 minutes later, I heard it. Initially, I couldn't recognize the sound. It was like if you recorded the sound of a blender and then listened to it on cheap headphones. The sound was high in pitch, but at the same time, it was a bit muffled and coarse. When I turned around, I saw the patient sitting up straight in bed. I gasped and moved back slightly. That sound I heard was her screaming into her ventilatory tube. Not yelling, not hollering. She was screaming bloody murder through her tube. Her eyes were bloodshot and bulging. It looked like she was also crying, but that may have been the artificial tears. Blood was also starting to leak down the corners of her mouth. Laryngeal trauma from her screaming so vigorously. Since she had COVID, there was no one in the room with her when she initially started screaming. This was part of infection control. In order for us in healthcare to not contract COVID, we needed to essentially be in hazmat suits to interact with a COVID patient. We all rushed to get the proper equipment on to enter her room. In that time, she managed to completely pull out her ventilatory tube, to our conjoint horror. I will never forget the things she said when we got to the bedside. She was pleading with us. Please send me back. Please, please, this is all wrong. This is not who I am anymore. I don't want to be here. It hurts and it's wrong. I don't want them to notice I left. I don't want them to notice. I want to go back. Please, please send me back. Mind you, she was saying this through the blood that was now leaking down her throat and up through her mouth from the trauma of removing the tube. We did eventually get the tube back in after we gave her some emergency sedation, but the damage was already done. She died a few hours later. One family member was able to visit her at bedside while she passed. We didn't have the heart to explain in full graphic detail what happened. We only said that she took her breathing tube out, and it caused a lot of damage. I don't know where our consciousness lies when we are sedated for that long, but I am afraid of that place. Death is permanent, but it is also balanced and equal. Everyone rests in oblivion, unbound from the traumas of life. The hells that we can create, however. Those places do not seem nearly as merciful. On December 17, 1938, 19-year-old college graduate Margaret Martin left her home in Kingston, Pennsylvania to meet with an unknown man who offered her a potential secretarial job. When she failed to return,
Martin's family reported her missing and began a search of the surrounding area. 4 days later, her body was discovered in the wilderness around 20 miles away. She had been horribly tortured, mutilated, and strangled before her bound and trussed body was dumped in a mountain stream, where it was found by a hunter. There were few clues as to her killer's identity, except the owner of a sawmill reported interrupting an unknown trespasser, and police believe this is where the murder occurred. Witnesses came forward with a description of a man seen with Martin around the time of her disappearance, but no one has ever been arrested and charged in connection with her murder. At the beginning of December 1938, Margaret Martin graduated with honors from Wilkes-Barre Business College, having attended classes to gain secretarial skills to find work as a stenographer. A former classmate, Betty Hopkins, described her as a shy, studious, friendly girl who had many friends, and she was well liked within the community of Kingston in Luzerne County, Pennsylvania. Her parents raised Margaret and her siblings as devout Catholics, and her father, John Martin, was a coal mine foreman and member of the local Democratic Committee. The Martins had 4 children, of which 19-year-old Margaret was the eldest, and included 17-year-old Mary, 15-year-old Helen, and 12-year-old Jack. Margaret Martin was contacted the Saturday morning of December 17, 1938, by an unknown man who offered her a job. He explained he was setting up an insurance company and was in need of a qualified stenographer and had a suitable secretarial position available. He added that he had heard of her through the Wilkes-Barre Business College. Miss Martin was gleefully anticipating her first job since graduating college and looking forward to earning some money before the Christmas holidays, so she agreed to meet with the man at Kingston Corners, located not far from the Martin family home. When she left the house that morning to keep her appointment with the mysterious telephone caller, Margaret promised her parents she would return home immediately. It would be the last time they saw her alive. When she failed to appear by the evening, her worried family and friends contacted the police and reported her missing. During the investigation into her disappearance, police and volunteers conducted a search of the surrounding area. Several witnesses came forward with information pertinent to the case. Martin was seen the day of her disappearance in conversation with an unknown man, and then getting into what was described as a black sedan or brown Plymouth. The description given of the man was vague, and he was believed to be a suave, neat, sandy-haired young man, slightly overweight and between the ages of 25 and 30 years old. None of the witnesses were able to identify the license plate of the car. There were numerous theories on what might have happened to Miss Martin, with some believing she had been kidnapped. The absence of a ransom note seemed to indicate that it was more likely she was either the victim of a sex maniac or had fallen victim to white slaver traders. The search failed to find any trace of her, and the publicity surrounding the disappearance was hampered because the local newspapers were on strike. On December 21, 1938, several days after she vanished, the body of Margaret Martin was discovered in the Wyoming County woodlands, around 25 miles from her home. 19-year-old Anthony Rezekowski was out trapping muskrats in the forested area when he made the grim discovery. As he places snares under a footbridge, he noticed a large burlap sack that had been partially submerged in 2 feet of shallow water in Keelersburg Creek, which was 8 miles from Tunkhannock. When he went to investigate further, he noticed the bag had been stitched with twine and one of the knots had slipped open, revealing a human arm. When he peeked inside, he saw the naked body of a young woman and immediately notified the police. It was soon identified as the body of Margaret Martin, and it was determined she had been dead for at least 24 hours. Tracks along the tiny Keelersburg Creek were blotted out by snow, and state troopers searched the immediate area looking for clues. The coroner concluded from the bruises to her neck that the cause of death was strangulation, but she suffered many other wounds. Her family was notified, and John Martin said of his daughter, "Our little girl fought for herself and died the pure girl she was," while her mother said, "She is with God today." Lieutenant Charles S. Cook headed a detail of the state police investigation into the murder and asserted the killer was apparently someone familiar with the Wyoming woodlands, who had driven a car to roughly 75 yards from the bridge, then carried the body to the spot where it was found. He reiterated this fact by saying, "Someone familiar with the territory placed the body in the creek, and it might not have been found for several years if the young man setting traps had not passed through the lonely section." Because of the remote location of the discovery and how the body was found, Lieutenant Cook was convinced that the murder took place somewhere else. The owner of a Forkston sawmill, James Kedd, reported finding a trespasser on his property and fired a warning shot in the intruder's direction, apparently scaring the man off. This incident occurred the day before Martin's body was discovered, and the sawmill was 12 miles from Keelersburg Creek. Police theorized the trespasser was the killer who murdered Martin inside the sawmill and then attempted to dismember her body and destroy it in the mill's firebox. Ashes were recovered from the sawmill boiler, and police were confident there would contain particles of clothing worn by Miss Martin, along with metal fragments believed to be a dress ornament. However, these were analyzed by a Wilkes-Barre chemist and found to contain only waste material. Major William Clark, the 3rd Squadron commander who headed the state police investigation, concluded that the sawmill theory had been almost eliminated, but more inquiries would be made. The only clues left with the body were the 2 burlap bags in which the body was found, a length of sash cord that had bound the body, and a gentleman's silk scarf, which had no identifying marks. On December 22nd, the Scranton Tribune predicted that the killer would be captured within the following 24 hours. The funeral of Margaret Martin was held on December 24th at St. Ignatius Church in Kingston, and hundreds of people were in attendance. Several plain-clothed officers were also present, working on the belief they might spot someone acting suspiciously. 4 days later, on December 28th, Pennsylvania State Senator Leo C. Mundy declared that he would introduce a bill at the next state legislature which would make sex crimes punishable by execution. It would also include the registration of all sex offenders and the requirement of all physicians, social and welfare workers to report anyone who exhibited such tendencies. Senator Mundy was prompted to introduce this bill as a direct result of Margaret Martin's brutal murder. The Deputy Commissioner of the State Police, Colonel Cecil M. Wilhelm, predicted that the mystery of her death would someday be solved. The investigation explored many other avenues, including a suspicious vehicle seen parked at the mountain cabin on the night of the murder, which might have belonged to the killer, but was soon ruled out when the owner gave police a satisfactory explanation for his movements in the area. Further leads also led nowhere. A reported incident where a bundle of clothing thrown from a car near Orwigsburg was suspected to be the killer disposing of Martin's clothes, but proved to be unrelated. Officers' attempts to check a statement that a witness attributed to a Kingston man who allegedly said, "I'm going to make a date with that Martin girl or break my neck in the attempt," proved fruitless. By early 1939, most leads in the case either fizzled out or resulted in a dead end for detectives. The manhunt for the killer would continue, and by February 1939, many suspects were investigated and discounted. 2 men who attempted to attack a 16-year-old girl from Hanover Township in Luzerne County were questioned and cleared. Many locals had their theories on who the killer might be, such as a mortician from Wyoming County, a local assistant pastor, a businessman's son who left the area soon after the murder, a local teenager who had a crush on the victim, and a teacher at the Wilkes-Barre Business College who held an infatuation with Martin. The case was the most baffling mystery the local and state police had ever encountered. In June 1939, the Luzerne County District Attorney's Office announced there would be no request to Luzerne County Commissioners to offer a reward for the capture of the killer. However, it was disclosed that new clues had surfaced in the case, which might soon lead to the arrest of one of 2 suspects. He did not specify what those clues were, nor whether an arrest was imminent. Despite this promising development, nothing further was revealed, and no arrests were made. In September 1942, 21-year-old Orban Taylor of New York City confessed to Scranton police that he was responsible for the death of Margaret Martin. Taylor was formerly a resident of Wilkes Barre and told investigators that he visited the area while serving in the U.S. Army. Despite his admission of guilt, Taylor was unable to reveal to detectives how he disposed of the victim's clothing, which had never been found. After more than 10 hours of questioning, the young man repudiated his confession. New York Detective Captain George W. Donaldson, who was leading the investigation, explained that the military authorities at Fort J joined the investigation being conducted by the State Motor Police and the Federal Bureau of Investigation because Taylor had been dishonorably discharged from the Army. Although he denied murdering Miss Martin, he did confess to other crimes, including several robberies, a stabbing in New York, and of defrauding several hotels in Philadelphia, Newark, New Jersey, and Elizabeth, New Jersey. Subsequently, he was not charged with murder. In the decades after her murder, the circumstances of Margaret Martin's death are still unexplained, and her killer has never been brought to justice. Many of those who worked the case came to believe the man responsible must have been a local because of his knowledge of the area, while others suspect it might have been the work of a serial killer. Despite the advancement of forensic science techniques, the case remains unsolved.